Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have some questions I'll answer from viewers, and I'll tell you about my trip to Europe. So let's get started. This tidbit came to me from AJ Bartlett, who posted this in my Ravelry group. It's an article on a website called This is Colossal, and the article is about glass artist Carol Milne, who uses glass to create sculptures of knitted hands. She uses a process called lost wax casting to create her sculptures, which I found really interesting because I usually think of glass sculpture as being something that's done with blowing and melting and hand manipulation. Like years ago, we were in Italy and we took a trip to Murano, which is an island just off from Venice. And that's where they have these amazing glass factories. So we watched these artisans just create incredible works of art, and I could have watched them for hours. And while we were in Venice, my mother-in-law bought me a Murano necklace as a souvenir gift. It's one of those handmade pieces that's just, it's so beautiful that, I just wanted to stare at it for a really long time. And one day as I was looking at it, I realized, oh, the artist had forgotten to put a little matching bead on the other side to make the necklace symmetrical. So I'm not a believer at all in that oft-repeated myth that craftspeople of particular cultures will deliberately put in mistakes in their work as a sign that they aren't perfect. We all make mistakes, and to deliberately insert a mistake is actually a design choice, not a mistake. Glass blowing is just the sort of glass art that I'm familiar with. So making these sculptures, as Carol does, using lost wax casting was just so interesting to me. Because when I was a kid, my dad experimented with lapidary, which is like rock polishing. So first he had like this little machine that would just tumble the rocks in order to polish them. And then he gradually learned to cut stones and carve them into various shapes. And then he started putting them into jewelry. So sometimes he used these pre-made wax casts for rings or other types of things. But other times he created his own wax cast and then melted the metal and poured them into the cast to create the metalwork himself. I just had never heard of that technique being used for anything other than metal. So to me, it's really fascinating that Carol Milne uses this process for casting her glass sculptures. But I'll leave links in the show notes to that article, and as well as to Carol's website, where you can see just a ton more photographs of her work. And I'm also going to leave a link to a Wikipedia article on lost wax casting so that you can maybe understand a little bit more about it if you're not familiar with that. In the Wikipedia article, they actually don't mention its use for glass, which makes me wonder if this is something that was a known use for this process, or if it's something that Carol developed on her own or figured out on her own. The Wikipedia article just doesn't mention its use outside of casting metal. This tidbit came to me from Kate on Ravelry, who said, I wonder if you saw this article about Annemor and her studies of the history of Norwegian knitting. It's an interesting article about her approach to the subject. So I had not seen this particular article that Kate sent me. I had certainly read about Annemor Sundbø, that's the best I can pronounce that in my Midwestern American accent. I had certainly read about her before, but I found this particular article just to be really interesting. It appears in an online quarterly magazine called The Craftsman. I'm guessing if you want to see her interviewed on camera, that either fruity knitting or Arnie and Carlos on their YouTube channels have either talked about her or to her. So you could look in their channels if you want to see her on camera. But if you're not familiar with her, Annemor Sundbø learned to spin and knit and weave when she grew up, shortly after World War II was over. And then as she grew up, she traveled the world and learning about textiles and also teaching textiles. And when she returned to Norway, she wanted to learn something about industrial weaving, the process of using those industrial machines. So she approached a factory owner asking if she could learn about it on his machines, but he said, you're going to have to buy the whole factory. So she did. And what she found at the factory were piles of mid-century and older hand knits that were kind of worn out and intended to be shredded and reused and recycled to create the factory's products. So this factory was one of the last, if not the last, shoddy factory in the country. Shoddy being a term that describes the use of recycled textiles to produce new textiles. So they would shred them up and then use that fiber again for other uses. Because she was accomplished in so many types of textile work, she was able to look at these knitted items and recognize these very familiar motifs that are used in Norwegian knits. And she could see the differences in how those motifs were used if they had been knit in one valley versus another valley, that there were these subtleties from one place to another. And she noticed that the size of that famous Sundbø rose motif changed, and that if it was knit into something that was made for someone after they had been confirmed, it would be much larger. So she could see by looking at these items where and how repairs were made and how they had been repurposed from one type of garment to another. And she just felt like there was so much information contained in these garments that there was no way that they should be relegated to being shredded. And she became passionate about preserving those garments as part of Norway's cultural heritage. There's just so much to learn from them. And I will leave a link down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me from Anne on Ravelry. In Anne's note, she said, I've always wondered how such blankets could have been made and ran across a video of anthropologist Mary Wiyaki making one. This was a turkey feather blanket that she was talking about. I had never heard of turkey feather blankets and couldn't even imagine what such a thing might look like. It turns out that what they are incredibly soft and fluffy blankets that take thousands of feathers and a lot of time to make. So the photo that I'm showing you here is one of Mary with the blanket she made draped over her shoulder. So Mary Wiyaki is an archaeologist and anthropologist for the state of New Mexico. She was asked back in 2018 if she could produce a turkey feather blanket for the museum. So textiles are notoriously bad at surviving long periods of time. So there were only very small fragments, small samples, remnants for her to study in order to teach herself this process. The turkey feather blanket technique goes back, they believe, about 1,000 years. The samples that she had to work from to reverse engineer the process were just so small. There was nothing that was anywhere near the size that she ended up making, which was about 2 feet wide by 3 feet long. And she used something like 17,000 feathers from 68 turkeys in order to make this blanket. It took her 18 months to do it. Now in this video, she goes through the entire process, each bit of it in brief form, but you get a full idea of what the process is. She demonstrates how the 2-ply cordage is made from yucca, the yucca plant, how those fibers are extracted, and then how they are drafted and turned into a 2-ply cordage. And then she shows a special tool that they use in order to facilitate inserting the feathers between the cordage and then wrapping the wet feather around it, the whole process. And then once all of those feathers are put into cordage, those are turned into the warp threads of the blanket, and then a thinner cordage is used for the weft fibers to secure everything. Mary is featured in a number of videos that were produced by the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture on their YouTube channel, which is where the video that I'm talking about resides. There's also a 2-hour video on the channel celebrating International Archaeology Day 2020 that explores Pueblo perishables. So it's a discussion between scholars and weavers of these woven textiles. So I'll leave links down below to a couple of different videos that Mary is in, as well as some articles about her work producing this turkey feather blanket. This tidbit I saw in my Twitter feed this morning, and then Nina K shared it in my Ravelry group as well. It's the latest installment of Deciphering Antique Knitting Patterns from Franklin Habit, and it appears on the Modern Daily Knitting website. So long before I had any interest in vintage or antique knitting patterns, I had a deep interest in Franklin's explorations of those old knitting patterns in his regular knitting column that he had years ago. Now, the pattern that he is discussing in the article that I'm going to link to is for ribbed fingerless mitts from Jane Gauguin's 1838 book of The Lady's Assistant. He explains the process of deciphering the original pattern and how Jane's presentation of patterns may seem really different than what we're used to today, but they were far superior to how other patterns were presented in books back at the same time. He includes a link to an image of the original pattern from The Lady's Assistant, so if you want to try knitting these gloves up and deciphering the pattern yourself, you can give it a go. In the past, I have supplied links to this 1838 book on archive.org that the pattern comes from in previous, tidbit segments. And Franklin supplies one within his article. Otherwise, he has a modernized, updated version in contemporary pattern speak that's available to his Patreon patrons. The article on Modern Daily Knitting gives information about the type of yarn that would be suitable, and he gives some clues about the needle size as well. Franklin just has a really humorous writing style. So even if you don't want to knit the mitts, if you have no interest in exploring vintage patterns yourself, it is really fun to read about his explorations and to see the results that he comes up with. Last week, I told you about the Shaker Hat Knit-Along event that was being run by a Shaker museum. I'll link last week's video above and then down in the show notes if you want to learn more about what I said about this historic piece of knitting and about the Knit-Along. So the Knit-Along is a free event with a gathering done via Zoom once per month. So the first one was this past weekend in October, and then there'll be one in November, and then the final one in December. And I was only able to tell you about it at the very last minute. After I mentioned it in last week's Casual Friday, they sold out of their available tickets. And what that means is that they reached their limit in terms of the number of people that their Zoom account can manage. So I did receive a copy of the pattern when I signed up for all 3 of the dates, but I didn't end up being able to attend the first meeting because it was the night before we were flying back from the Netherlands, and it wasn't going to start until 11 p.m. Europe time. I just couldn't stay awake. But I do plan on knitting up the hat to see how it works out. And if you were one of the people who tried to sign up for the class but you failed to get in on it, the good news is that anyone who wants a copy of the pattern can get it, along with patterns for previous knit-alongs. This is the 3rd knit-along that they've done through that Shaker Museum. One of the patterns, I believe, was, I don't know if one was mittens and one was gloves. But for sure, one of the knit-alongs was one of those types of accessories. But if you want to get any of those patterns, you can do so by emailing the person from the museum who is running the knit-along event. I don't want to leave her email address in the show notes because that's just an invitation for internet bots to spam her. So if you do want more information about how to get those patterns, it's in my Ravelry group in the discussion thread for last week's video. So I will leave a link to that in the show notes. I'm also going to leave a link to the Shaker Museum's YouTube page as well. They did say that the meeting was recorded, and at some point they'll put it up on their YouTube channel. We just don't know when. So you can get a copy of the pattern, and you will at some point be able to see what was going on at that first event. It's not on the channel yet, at least it wasn't earlier today, but at some point it will be. But you may find some other things on their YouTube channel that are interesting to see as well. Back in September, I began soliciting questions from my viewers that they might have about YouTube, either how it functions or how I do things on YouTube, whatever it was that you wanted to know. So I answered quite a few of those questions before I went on my trip to Europe, but I do have a couple of new ones that have come up that I thought I would answer. So the first question is, on my iPad, how do I search for a topic? For example, jogless joining in the round in your videos. If you are using a mobile device or tablet, so you're using a phone or a tablet, you are more than likely accessing YouTube through an app rather than going to their website. So if you're on a desktop computer and you want to go to YouTube, you're going to the YouTube website. So the way that apps operate is different from the way that the website operates. And they have different teams of programmers who are programming those different ways of accessing YouTube. So if you're on a desktop computer, you can do a channel search. If you are on that YouTube channel's main channel page, you can do a search of that channel. You cannot do that on an app. There is a search box, but that is the general YouTube search. That is not a channel-specific search. So you can get around this, searching my channel on a mobile device, by using that general YouTube search box, typing in the name of the thing that you would like to find, and then putting in my name after that. There are ways of using a mobile or tablet device and accessing the actual YouTube website. You have to do that, though, through a browser. So you have to do it through Chrome or Safari. So my suggestion would be just to do the workaround, which is type the topic that you're looking for and then use my name. That would be the easiest way. The second question was in the comments of a Casual Friday video where I did a segment on how I do spreadsheets, how I use spreadsheets for my projects. They really liked the tutorial I gave for spreadsheets in that particular segment, but they're struggling to find a different episode of Casual Friday where I also did a segment on spreadsheets where I talked about how I use spreadsheets to calculate how long something's going to take to knit. And this person said, you talked about your 3-week limit of interest for a project. Could you help me find this particular video? I'd be so grateful. So first of all, I get questions about how I use spreadsheets enough times that the 2 Casual Friday episodes that I have done where I've gone through how I use spreadsheets, both have the word spreadsheet in the title. So if you do a search on my channel for spreadsheet, you will be able to find both of those videos and then go to those particular segments. But I did want to kind of address a couple of things that this person maybe misunderstood about how I use spreadsheets, and probably misunderstand them because they haven't been able to see this other segment. Before I start any project, I create a spreadsheet. And one of the main things I'm wanting to do is to calculate the total number of stitches that this particular project is going to have. I didn't start out doing this in order to figure out how long it was going to take me to knit. I wanted to be able to track my progress as I knit the project. So I wanted to know, when am I at the 5% mark? When am I on the 10% mark? When am I on the 35% mark? Because in Ravelry, in your Ravelry notebook, when you create a project page, one of the things that you can do is indicate how far along you are in 5 percentage point increments. So that's something that I'm interested in doing. It wasn't until I've been doing that for a number of years and had collected a lot of data for how long I did spend on working a project, and plus I knew how many stitches were in it, that I recognized that I could figure out, oh, how many stitches do I typically knit in a week? Like, I knew that on an average sock would take me about a week to knit. If I'm just knitting at my regular pace, I don't have a deadline, I'm not trying to race through it. If I'm just knitting at my regular knitting pace, it takes me about a week to knit one sock. I can knit a pair in a week if I have a gift deadline. I have even been known to knit a whole sock in a 24-hour time period. If I do that, then I don't knit for a couple of days. So it all averages out for me over a 1 week time period. I also began to realize that my attention span for a project is about 3 weeks. I don't tend to jump back and forth between projects at the same time. Some people do, I do not. I tend to focus on one project until I get really mad at it. Maybe I get frustrated and it needs a timeout. That can happen, and so I'll put it to the side. Or I'll just like, oh, I've been working on this 3 weeks, I want to do something different, and then I'll put it to the side. So I looked at those things. It takes me about a week to knit an average sock. I know that the socks I knit tend to have 12 to 15,000 stitches, depending on what yarn weight I'm using and who I'm knitting it for. And so I just realized that, oh, I knit about 2,000 to 2,500 stitches in an average day. Not a lot. I don't really knit that many hours per day. I spend a lot of my time thinking and talking about knitting, but I don't spend that many hours every day knitting. So I just recognized that, 2,500 stitches in a day over 3 weeks, maybe if the sweater had 50 to 55,000 stitches in it, which, like this sweater right here, this was a 3-week sweater. I knit the whole thing in 3 weeks, and then I put it to the side before I did. I think I waited to do the button bands. I waited a few weeks or a month, bought some buttons, and then I did the button band. But this was like a 3-week sweater. So this, I think, was the sweater where I started to really realize what was going on and what my pattern of behavior was. So now when I create a spreadsheet and I see how many stitches are in it, now I know, oh, that's going to take me this long, or this is, I have some idea about how long realistically it's going to take me, and whether or not I'm going to probably need to take a break during the course of knitting it. So this is just data that I've accumulated, and it wasn't for the purpose of figuring out how long it was going to take me to knit. But if you are interested in either one of those 2 videos where I do talk about how I use spreadsheets, how I kind of set them up, I'll put links to both of those down in the show notes. And if you are particularly interested in these spreadsheets and you have questions that I don't seem to answer in either of those segments, please let me know if there's something else you'd like to know or watch me do when it comes to creating a spreadsheet for a project. I am still tired. We got back from our trip to Europe on Monday afternoon, and it's now Friday afternoon. And I probably look a little tired to you. It's been a tougher transition to adjust to the time difference this week than it was on the way there. It was a very quick transition on the way there. I finally was able to sleep until 4 a.m. this morning, instead of waking up at 1 or 2 a.m. and then falling asleep at 7:30 or 8 p.m. This was our first trip by plane since the pandemic began. We've taken some road trips, but this is our first plane trip, and it was a long one. Our daughter, Nina, lives in Amsterdam with her fiance, Sam. So we did get to see them last year when they came to the U.S. for an extended trip in the fall. but we hadn't been to visit them since April of 2019. So the plan was to spend the first 4 days in the Netherlands, when our other daughter, Sophia, was also going to be there. She got there several days before we did and got to have some sister time with Nina. And then we showed up and got to have the entire family together. And then after that 4 days, my husband and I went to Portugal for a week. And then we came back to the Netherlands for 3 days before we flew back to the US. So we spent more time than we would have liked moving from accommodation to accommodation, because just the time blocks that we were in a particular place, maybe they didn't have all of the days available for us to stay there, and so we'd have to move. Our flight to Portugal was delayed and didn't get in until 2 a.m. So then the rental car place was shut and we had to walk in the rain to a hotel near the airport. You know, so there was a lot of like every couple of days packing up and going to the next place, which is exhausting. We learned a lot from that and how we would do things differently the next time, because there will be a next time, because Nina and Sam, you know, have plans to continue living in Amsterdam for an indefinite period of time. So we'll probably go there at least once a year going forward. So, and we've also kind of gotten past that hump of returning to air travel and just kind of the stress of navigating all of that that we haven't done in several years. So I did have a couple of things I wanted to do in Amsterdam, and one was to visit a particular yarn shop and to help Nina pick out some yarn. She has been wanting me to teach her to knit, but she didn't want to do it by video or by Zoom or FaceTime or anything like that. And she has a number of friends that are creative and have crafts that they do, and had been interested in maybe having some sort of craft group or knitting group when we were visiting. And so that was something we had in mind, that I would teach her to knit, and maybe some of her friends as well. Stephen West, the designer, has a yarn shop in Amsterdam. It's called Stephen and Penelope. So I thought, well, it'd be fun to go there and see what that shop looks like and get her some yarn and needles. So we did that, and my husband Michael found some yarn that he liked that he thought would be nice for a hat. I usually make him a new hat every couple of years, and it's time. It's a nice little shop. They have a great selection of yarn. The staff are very friendly, very helpful. It was really bustling with activity, so they had a lot of customers coming and going. It was an enjoyable shop. So after we left the yarn shop, I knew that we were in a neighborhood that we had been in the very first time that my husband and I had come to Amsterdam back in 2015. Nina was not with us. And I remember walking by this building and just recognizing it. I knew I'd seen it before, and I thought, I bet I know what this is. I wasn't positive, but I just had a feeling, and I went and looked it up later, and it was true. It's the northern gate of the Walloon Church. So the Walloons were these French-speaking religious refugees from like France and Belgium. At the end of the 16th century, they came to Amsterdam, and the city government gave them this offered them this chapel to use for their own church. It had, years before, it had been a monastery chapel and had been confiscated during the Protestant Reformation by the city, and so it was given to the Walloons. So these were religious refugees in Amsterdam. And in 1626, the Dutch West India Company, which had established a colony called New Netherland in what is now New York, the state of New York. They had soldiers, and then there were fur trappers who would go there and make their fortune and then leave, but nobody wanted to stay permanently. And so the company wanted to bring some families over there that would be permanent settlers. And so the first boatload of people they brought over were some of these Walloon religious refugees who were our ancestors. So there was a lot of death and remarriage back in those days, and there weren't a lot of people to choose from. So sometimes they were cousins marrying cousins. My 10th, he's also my 11th great grandfather, Philippe, was married twice. And with one wife, he had a daughter named Marie, and the second wife, he had a daughter named Susanna. I'm descended from both of those daughters. Marie had 2 husbands, and I'm descended from 2 of her children, one from each marriage. In addition, Marie had a daughter and Susanna had a daughter who were each married to the same man. Like Marie's daughter was married to him first, then she died, and then Susanna's daughter married him. So there's like all of these conversions going all the way down. So my grandfather's parents turned out to be 8th cousins, and they certainly wouldn't have known that. But anyway, I have this family history that goes back to this church that we just happened to walk by a few years ago, and I was like, oh my gosh. So when we left the yarn shop, I wanted to show it to Nina and tell her a little bit about that. And then we went to this house that was on one of the canals where her friend Nicole was dog sitting, and we got to meet her. So that was a lot of fun. And we just mostly we were walking around and getting meals and talking and doing, you know, interesting, fun things. We did go to the Van Gogh Museum. We had been there back in 2015 and we really liked it. And since then, I had found out that Van Gogh had this box of yarn that he would use in order to learn more about color theory. He would have these balls of yarn and he would see how they interacted with each other, which I found fascinating because when I first learned to knit in Ireland and I came back to the US for a year to finish my degree, I was living with some art students, and one of them took me to a yarn shop and showed me this trick of how colors change when you put them, mix them together like that, when you lay one color on top of another, and how they change the way that they look. The girls wanted to go to the Van Gogh Museum, and I wanted specifically to see that box of yarn. Now, it's not the original yarn that he had worked with, but it is the box that he had held his yarn, and they do have balls of yarn in there as a substitute for the original ones. So then we flew to Portugal for a week. We were in Porto, and then we drove down to Lisbon. We stopped in a town, Aveiro, I think is the name of it. It's like a little canal town that's known for its salt production. That was an unexpected thing. We just stopped there. We took the canal tour. We learned a little bit, had a nice lunch, and then continued on to Lisbon. So there's a lot of walking around and eating meals is mostly what we did. Porto and Lisbon are both very, very hilly areas. And in Lisbon, we were staying in probably one of the oldest neighborhoods in Lisbon, the very narrow streets. And we had a rental car. And so we arrived in Lisbon at like 4 in the afternoon. It was a beautiful day. And there were tourists all over, like people just walking through the streets, and a lot of cars, and it was really difficult, you know, navigating. And I was trying to navigate, and we're like, okay, I have to turn right here, and the hotel's on this street. And my husband goes to turn the corner, and there's this big cylindrical barrier in the road. And I said, there's a barrier, you can't go up this way. And he was going to try to drive around. I'm like, there's no way you could drive around it. So then he ended up swerving back into all the traffic. And then we had to try to find a place to park in order to call the hotel. And so we called them and explained what was going on. She basically told us to come back to that barrier and then call her. And we're like, okay. So we drove back to, I was pretty sure we were driving back to the same place, and then the barrier wasn't there, and we were just able to drive up the road, and then we could see her standing in the road in front of the hotel waiting for us, but the road is like this wide. Turns out that these cylindrical barriers, which we don't have anything like that here in the US that I know, that I have ever seen, is that you have like, you can have like a card, like a key card or something that will lower it down, or you could have a remote control. So the hotel has a remote control that will let it go up and down. But, you know, I saw the barrier and I thought there's no way. So I'm going to put a little video that kind of shows walking down the street where our hotel was. So you can kind of see how narrow the street was. It rained a lot when we were in Lisbon. We did manage to go to the Tile Museum, the National Tile Museum. I told Nina, who had been to Portugal, I said, oh, we want to go to the Tile Museum. And she said, the whole country's a tile museum. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it was true, like the buildings, so many were just covered with tiles. And even modern buildings that, you know, you could tell the architecture was super modern, and they would still include a little bit of tile going up some particular part of it. But others were just completely covered from top to bottom in tile. We were only in Lisbon for a couple of days, and then we drove back up to Porto and stayed overnight, and then flew out the next morning back to Amsterdam. So I'd bought Nina her yarn, and finally she figured out when she could have her friends over and to have a little knitting class. So some of her friends just came over to meet us and work on their own individual crafts, not knitting. But her friend Connor for sure really wanted to learn to knit. And Nina wanted to learn to knit. I had offered to make videos for her specifically, like, oh, I can, or we could do it by FaceTime. She's like, no, I want to learn to knit in person with you right there. I knew Connor wanted to knit. We'd bought Nina her yarn. And then like an hour or so before we were all getting together, Sam said he wanted to learn to knit too. So we went to the craft store, a different, actual craft store. It's like a Michael's, only it's like 1/8 the size. And so I taught the three of them to knit. Now, I had not taught a beginning knitting class for, I think, 7 years. The last few years I was teaching knitting, I'd stopped doing the beginning classes. I was mostly doing technique classes and clinics and maybe some more advanced or intermediate type classes. That experience in Amsterdam was so much like a regular, like one of those old knitting classes. I always limited those beginner classes to a maximum of 4 students, because it takes so much one-on-one concentration for somebody who's never done this before. But the way it worked out, like Nina did know how to knit. She learned to knit from a teacher when she was like 10 years old. And she made a tiny little project, and then she never knit again. She didn't believe she'd remember, and I'm like, no, you'll have muscle memory. And her friend Connor was really excited about it and been watching videos and doing a lot of research. He's like treating this new thing he wanted to do the way I do, where I do all this research ahead of time so that I'll know as much as I can before I actually get started. So he just caught on so quickly. And he just conceptually understood what was going on, and he needed very little supervision. And I taught him how to purl within, probably 20 minutes to half an hour. He was purling, and then I taught him ribbing, and he just really caught on. And Nina, much more methodical, like she was doing just fine. And I said, you want me to teach you to purl? No. And then about an hour later, you want me to teach you to purl? No, I want to become an expert on this first. So, that's how some of my students would do it in the past. I'm like, oh, you're ready to purl? No, there's just some people who want to just keep going, next thing, next thing, next thing. And then other people who are like, no, I'm going to be doing this thing, until I feel like I can do it in my sleep, and then I'll learn the next thing. Now, Sam, who hadn't really been thinking about learning to knit until an hour before, he didn't expect it to be such a challenge. He's like, oh, I really am disappointed in myself. I expected more of myself. It's a skill, and I think he's seen me knitting, and I, knit without looking at what I'm doing, and it's very smooth because I've been knitting for 35 years. So it seems like it shouldn't be that complicated until you try to handle 2 needles and yarn at the same time and develop muscle memory that you don't have for something that you've never done before. So it was a lot harder for him, and it was a lot more fatiguing for him as well. So he ended up having to take a break. Nina's got some ideas for what she would like to make, and she's got a good sense of what she could be capable of, particularly based on her level of what she's willing to learn at this point. And she's got a good eye for it. Basically, she had seen on Instagram somebody had done like an adult bonnet type of thing, and had just, somebody just posted that they'd made something. It wasn't a pattern or anything. And I've only made a couple of bonnets before, and they had different constructions from each other. So I spent some time thinking about how bonnets are related to hats, and looking at a lot of different bonnet constructions to see like what is consistent and then where the variation comes in order to create something for her. So when we got back to Minneapolis and I was so brain dead the next day, I just figured out, I just made a bonnet in garter stitch and kind of figured out, well, how would I do this or how would I teach her? And my husband wants to learn to knit too, but he doesn't want to learn from me directly. He wants me to make videos that he can watch. So I've been thinking about this, that I hadn't taught beginners in so long, and that's an area that I don't really cover on my channel. And so I'm thinking about putting together some sort of beginner series that would maybe come out in the early part of the new year. I'll still be doing the regular technique videos that I already do. It's just something that I want to add to my channel that I think isn't there right now. So that was really fun to kind of go back to teaching in person and teaching beginners and remembering what it is that they struggle with or the questions that they have. We had a great time. I had a lot of fun meeting her friends and eating a lot of great food in different places and then seeing different landscape and all of that sort of thing. If you're new to my Casual Friday podcast, you can explore the entire back catalog of Casual Friday episodes over here. Or maybe you want to check out my series of videos on basic sweater construction styles over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.